Alright, so we got our model and UVs done. Now we're going to set up for render into texture. And this will allow us to take the detail that we modeled in the high poly and transfer it into the texture maps and onto our low poly mesh. So I made a copy of my low poly after everything's done, and I'm just going to go ahead and remove all the stuff that would overlap. The screen here is actually going to be on a second material ID, so I'm just going to move that off the grid so it doesn't have any effect on the texture itself. And you can see I got the back plates mirrored, so I'm going to take the part that's mirrored over, and I don't want anything overlapping. If you have overlap in geometry, it's going to create problems with the bake. So alright, so this is going to be our high poly bake, and we're going to make a copy of our original high poly, and I just name mine usually RTT for render texture under the layer, and we're going to use this one to explode the mesh, and that means you're going to take parts and push them away from the mesh to help it so it will bake on the low poly correctly. Alright, so I got everything all exploded and ready to go, so I'm going to bring up the rendering dialog, and I set my filters and stuff up here, and you can pause the video and see my screen settings and everything if you have a hard time following along. But we're going to go ahead and drop a skylight in, and this will help us. We're using Light Tracer now, and there's a bunch of different ways that you can do this. You can use Mental Ray or just the default scan line. I'm focusing more on the default scan line here. So with the low poly selected, you want to bring up the render to texture dialog, and you can see the cage is kind of all messy now, so we'll want to go in and reset the cage and push it out so it totally encloses the high poly with the low, and the cage is actually projecting from the low poly, so you can see it sticking out. And so we'll go ahead and set it up to bake a lighten map and our normal map, and we'll want to set that up so they'll bake to a location that'll be easy for us to find. And usually I'll do this under a folder in the root of my model that says textures, and I'll create a subfolder called bakes, and I'll save everything there as it's a lot easier to find later on. So it renders out. It takes a little bit of time. I skipped over the rendering phase. It's not really that exciting to watch. So we got our first bakes done. We're going to go ahead and apply them to a material and see what they look like in the viewport. Make sure there's no errors. Make sure it baked out clean, and we can see all the details and everything. So I'm making a multi-sub-object material right here because ID 1's going to be for the main base and ID 2 is going to be for the screen itself. So we'll go ahead and just grab our bake and our normal map as well. And so we'll take a look, see what it looks like in the viewport. It's looking pretty good. Looks like it transferred pretty well, and I'm pretty happy with the results. So go ahead and yeah, that looks pretty good. So we'll go ahead and save this out and move on to the texturing stage. So you can see this is actually the low poly geometry, and it actually has, you know, all the detail from the high poly on it. And the bakes are pretty nice, and this is what allows us to get a ton of detail in game assets that we can't afford to use geometry for everything. So up next we'll be going into Photoshop and texturing.